Audiobook presents Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Do not change me as I gave you. In the dawn of civilization and the birth of a nation, words become weapons. This is not just a pamphlet. It is an act of defiance, a cry for liberty that resonated throughout the American colonies, igniting the flame of revolution. In Common Sense, Thomas Paine does not appeal to scholars or the elite. He appeals to you, the farmer, the merchant, the common citizen. With clear and forceful logic, Paine dismantles tyranny, questions the legitimacy of monarchy, and charts the only viable path to independence. Through these pages, you will hear the argument that transformed loyal subjects into fierce republicans, the text that convinced a generation that the time had come to separate from the empire and forge their own destiny. Listen to the work that not only changed the course of American history but defined the true meaning of the word republic. Prepare to witness the power of the purest and most radical ideas. Chapter 1. The Origin and Design of Government in General, with brief observations on the English Constitution. Some writers have so greatly confused society with government that they make very little or almost no distinction between the two, when not only are they different from each other, but they also have distinct origins. Pausa. Society is the result of our needs, and government that of our wickedness. Pausa. The former promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections, and the latter negatively by restricting our vices. One encourages intercourse among men, the other creates distinctions. The one is a protector, and the other a scourge of humanity. Society in all cases offers advantages, while government, being a necessary evil in its best state, is intolerable in its worst state. Pausa. For when we suffer or are exposed because of government to the same miseries we might experience without it, our calamities are compounded by the realization that we have caused our own suffering by the very means with which we intended to avoid it. Government is like clothing, the badge of lost innocence. The palaces of kings are built upon the ruins of paradise. Pausa. If man were uniformly obedient to the impulses of right conscience, he would need no other lawgiver. But this not being the case, it is necessary for him to sacrifice a part of his property to provide for the security and protection of the rest, following the dictate of prudence, which advises him in this case to choose the lesser of two evils. Pausa. Therefore, since security is the true object and end of governments, it is a clear consequence that the form of government which can guarantee us this inestimable good with the least possible burden will be preferable to all others, to acquire a clear and exact idea of the object of government. Let us suppose a small number of people settled in a remote place, detached from the rest of the earth. They will then represent the first settlers of a country, or of the world. In this state of natural liberty, society will be their first thought. Pausa. 1,000 motives will induce it. The strength of one man is so unequal to his needs, and his mind so incapable of perpetual solitude, that he will soon be obliged to solicit the assistance and help of another, who will reciprocally need the same from him, under equal circumstances. 4 or 5 individuals thus united can erect a moderate hut in the midst of a wilderness, but one man alone would employ almost his whole life in this task. When he had cut the timber, he could not raise it, nor transport it as he wished. Hunger, meanwhile, would oblige him to leave his work, and his diverse needs would call him to different tasks. Illnesses and misfortunes would be all fatal to him, because although neither one nor the other might be truly serious, they would nonetheless incapacitate him from living, and reduce him to a state which can be called death rather than life. Necessity, then would unite these first settlers in society, who, remaining always faithful to virtue and justice, would live happily without the support of government, rendering the obligations of law useless. But since perfection is only found in heaven, and men are so prone to vice, it would inevitably result that as they overcame the difficulties of nature, the object of their union, they would begin to disregard their duties, and relax the bonds of mutual benevolence, until they found themselves in the necessity of establishing a form of government, to supply the defect of moral virtues. A tree would serve them as a town hall, under whose branches the entire population could gather to deliberate on public affairs. It is more than probable that their first laws would only have the title of regulations, and that the only penalty for their infringement would be public discredit. In this first Parliament all men would have a seat by natural right. But as society prospered, public business would likewise increase. The members of the community would separate with the increase in population, and distance would be an obstacle to them gathering in all circumstances as at the beginning, when their number was smaller, their habitations closer, and their public business of small account. Pausa. Then the advantage would be recognized of consenting that the legislative part be directed by a number of individuals chosen from the whole body, who would have the same interest as the rest, and act in the same way the whole body would act if it were present. Pausa. Continuing the increase in population, it would be necessary to also increase the number of representatives, and to properly attend to the interest of each part of the community, it would become indispensable to divide the whole into proportional parts, entrusting each representative with a competent number. Pausa. Prudence would likewise indicate the necessity of holding frequent elections, so that the elected could never have an interest different from that of the electors. For in this way, being able to return to the class of the electors, they would be faithful to the public due to the impossibility of perpetuating themselves in command. And as this frequent change must establish an equal interest among all parts of the community, these would be mutually and reciprocally united. It is in this union, therefore, that the strength of a government and the happiness of the governed consists, not in the detestable name of king. Here is the origin and birth of government, which is only necessary in the world for lack of moral virtues. Its object and end are liberty and security. And these principles of justice, dictated by nature and confirmed by reason, will be eternal, no matter how a brilliant and pompous appearance may dazzle our eyes for a moment, no matter how harmony may flatter our ear, how prejudices may mislead our will, and how private interest may obscure our understanding. From an incontrovertible natural principle, I deduce my idea about government, and that is that the simplest machine is the one that is least likely to break down, and the one that, once broken down, is repaired with the greatest ease. Pausa. Guided by this maxim, I will make some brief observations on the famous and much vaunted English Constitution. Let us agree that it was good, regarding the times of darkness and slavery in which it was formed, because when the whole world groaned under the weight of tyranny, the slightest change toward good was a step toward liberty. But it is easy to demonstrate that this Constitution is imperfect, subject to convulsions, and incapable of producing what it seems to promise. Absolute governments, although they are a disgrace to human nature, have the advantage in themselves of being simple. If the people suffer, they clearly know the root from which their pain springs, and are not exposed to being confused and lost in the variety of causes and remedies. But the Constitution of England is so extremely complicated that the nation may suffer for many years without being able to discover what part the evil that afflicts it lies in. Some will say here and others elsewhere, and each political doctor will prescribe a different plaster. I am well aware of how difficult it is to banish local and ingrained prejudices. Nevertheless, if we examine the parts of which the English Constitution is composed, we will find that its foundations are the debris of two ancient tyrannies, and that it is only made up of patches, amended with some republican forms. Pausa. First, the remains of a tyrannical monarchy, in the person of the king. Second, the remains of an aristocratic monarchy in the persons of the peers. Third, the new republican parts in the persons of the House of Commons, upon whose virtue the liberty of England depends. The first two, being hereditary, are independent of the people, for which reason, and in a constitutional sense, they contribute nothing to the happiness of the state. To say that the English Constitution is a union of three powers, which restrain one another, is a farce. It is committing a vicious circle of contradictory ideas. Pausa. To say that the House of Commons checks the king's power is to suppose two things. One, that the king should not be absolutely trusted, without fearing the abuse of his authority, and that the vehement desire for absolute power is the natural disease of monarchy. 2. That the House of Commons, having the objective of setting limits to absolute power, is considered either wiser or more worthy of confidence than the Crown. Pausa. But since the same Constitution that gives the House of Commons the power to check the king's faculties, by denying him the necessary aids, afterwards grants the king another power to check the House of Commons, by authorizing him to reject their bills, it is supposed a second time that the king is wiser than those who were previously supposed to be wiser than him. What an absurdity! There are things extremely ridiculous in the composition of monarchy. 1. A man is excluded from the means of general instruction, and in particular from those of informing himself about matters on which he must deliberate. Yet he is authorized to rule on matters that require the greatest wisdom. The status of a king separates him from the world, and yet a king's business requires him to know men perfectly. Therefore, his different actions in life, singular, opposing one another, and distinguishing one from the other, proves that his character is absurd and useless. Some writers have explained the English Constitution in the following way. The king, they say, is one, and the people are another. The peers form one house in favor of the former, and the commons another in favor of the latter. But this itself proves that the government has all the distinctions of a house internally divided. And although these expressions may sound pleasant to the ear, it would be futile to attempt to extract their meaning by an exact analysis of the complicated ideas they contain. Pausa. Because said analysis includes a prior question, namely, how could the king obtain a power that the people are afraid to trust, and which they are always obliged to restrain? Pausa. Such a power cannot be the gift of a wise people, nor can it be from God, being a power that needs restrictions. Nevertheless, the Constitution grants it and supposes such a power to exist. But since this power has forces superior to what its object needs, the means it employs to achieve it are disproportionate and consequently useless. The following comparison will further clarify the matter. Pausa. All the wheels of a machine are set in motion by the impulse of another, in which the motive force resides. Even if one or some of those wheels can obstruct, or, as is the word, check the speed of this one's movement, as long as they cannot stop it, their efforts will be fruitless. The first power that moves will ultimately continue its course, and what it loses in speed it will gain in time. And since the greater weight always causes the lesser to ascend, it remains, therefore, to know to which individual the English Constitution grants this greater weight or this power, because this is the one that will ultimately govern. It is clear that the Crown is this oppressive part in the English Constitution, And it is also evident that it has the greatest influence and transcendental consequence, by being the sole distributor of favors, positions, and pensions. For although the English were wise enough to close the door to absolute monarchy, they were at the same time foolish enough to hand the key to the crown. The prejudice of the English in favor of their government by the king, lords, and commons stems more from a national pride than from enlightened reason. Individuals undoubtedly enjoy greater security in England than in any other country, but the will of the king is a law as supreme in Great Britain as in France. The difference is that, instead of flowing directly from his mouth, it is announced to the people under the formidable form of a decree of Parliament. The unfortunate fate of Charles I has made kings more subtle, but not more just. Leaving aside, then, all national pride and prejudice in favor of the English system, the pure truth is that if the crown is not as oppressive in England as in France, it is due to the individual constitution of those natives, rather than to that of their government. It is indispensable at this time to make an analysis of the constitutional errors in the form of the English government. For just as we are never in a position to do justice to others while we continue under the influence of a dominant party, so too are we incapable of doing justice to ourselves while we are dominated by a blind passion. And so, also, just as a man fond of prostitutes is incapable of knowing the happiness promised by a virtuous wife, so a prejudice in favor of the rotten constitution of a government incapacitates us from distinguishing and judging the merit of a good one. Chapter 2. Of Monarchy and Hereditary Succession. Being that humankind was originally equal in the order of creation, equality could only be destroyed by certain subsequent circumstances. Pause. The distinctions of rich and poor can very well exist without resorting to the harsh and discordant names of oppression and avarice. Oppression is often the consequence of wealth, but rarely or never the means to it. And although avarice keeps a man from beggary, it also, almost generally, instills too much fear in him to be able to become rich. But there is a distinction among men so enormous that it cannot be justified by reasons drawn either from nature or from religion. This is the distinction noted between kings and subjects, and it is a matter highly worthy of our attention to inquire how a race so superior to the rest of men, and so privileged that it seems to be of a very different species, came into the world. And it is also incumbent upon us to investigate whether these demigods are more useful than harmful to the happiness of humankind. In the primitive times of the world, according to the chronology of the Holy Scripture, there were no kings, and consequently there were no wars. The pride of kings has plunged the human species into an abyss of darkness and confusion. Pause. Holland, without a king, has enjoyed more peace in the last century than any other monarchical government in Europe. Antiquity presents the patriarchs enjoying a pure happiness in the fields, which disappears when we come to the history of the Jewish monarchy. The government of kings was first introduced into the world by the pagans, in imitation of whom the children of Israel adopted it. This has been the devil's most felicitous invention to promote idolatry. The pagans paid divine honors to their deceased kings, and the Christian world has perfected the plan of slavery by deifying their own while alive. Pause. How impious is the title of sacred royal majesty applied to an insect, which, in the midst of its splendor, is dissolving into dust. The elevation of one man to such a superior rank above the rest cannot be justified by the theory of equal rights, nor can it be defended by the authority of Scripture. For the will of the Almighty disapproves of the government of kings, as is evident from the prophets Samuel and Gideon. Pause. All the pronouncements of the Holy Scripture against kings have been maliciously interpreted in favor of monarchical governments. And this must fix the attention of countries whose government is yet to be formed. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's is the text of the Holy Scripture most often repeated in the courts, and this one is not very favorable to monarchical government. Because the Jews, when they obtained this answer, were without a king and only subject to the Roman people, who were then governed by a republic that had sworn eternal hatred to kings since the expulsion of the Tarquins. According to the chronology of Moses, the Jews came to ask for a king nearly 3,000 years after the creation. Until then, their form of government, except in extraordinary cases where the Almighty intervened, was a kind of republic administered by a judge and the elders of the tribes. They had no kings, and it was considered a crime to recognize under this title any other than the Lord of hosts. Pausa. Thus, when one reflects on the idolatrous homage paid to the persons of the kings, it is not surprising that the Almighty, always jealous of his honors, should disapprove of a form of government that so impiously usurps the prerogatives of the divinity. Monarchy is considered in Scripture as one of those sins of the Jews for which a reserved curse was declared against them. The history of this fact is worthy of all attention. The children of Israel, being oppressed by the Midianites, marched against them with a small army under the command of Gideon, and victory, through the interposition of the Almighty, was declared in their favor. The Jews, proud of the triumph and attributing it to Gideon's talents, attempted to make him king, saying, "Rule over us, you and your sons, and your sons' sons." This was the greatest absurdity. They not only offered him a kingdom, but also a hereditary kingdom. But Gideon, with a piety proper to his soul, responded, "I will not rule over you, nor will my sons rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." These words need no further explanation. Gideon does not refuse the honor, but denies their right to give it to him. And far from giving them expressive thanks, he reproaches them in the sublime style of a prophet for their disaffection and ingratitude toward their legitimate sovereign, the King of Heaven. 130 years later, they incurred the same error for a second time. The extreme inclination of the Jews to the idolatrous customs of the pagans cannot be conceived. Taking as a pretext the bad conduct of the sons of Samuel, who were in charge of some secular business, they went to the house of that venerable prophet, and began to shout to him, "You see that you are already old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Establish a king over us to judge us, as all the other nations have." And we shall observe here in passing that their reasons were bad, in that they could be like the other nations, that is, like the pagans, when on the contrary, their true glory consisted in being as little like them as possible. Pausa. This reasoning displeased Samuel, because they had said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt even unto this day, as they have forsaken me, and served other gods, so do they also unto you. Now therefore listen to their voice. However, solemnly warn them and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. This is not the right of any particular king, but the general conduct of the kings of the earth whom Israel so eagerly imitated. And notwithstanding the great distance of time and difference of customs and habits, the character is still the same, and will be eternally so. Pausa. And so Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked him for a king. And he said, "This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots." This description exactly corresponds with the custom of the day in the courts of the kings. And he will make them his tribunes and centurions, and to labor in his fields and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. He will also take your daughters to be his perfumers, and to be his cooks, and to be his bakers. Yet this alludes to the luxury and lust of kings. And he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. And he will tithe your harvests and the clippings of the vineyards, to give them to his eunuchs and servants. By this it can be seen that bribery, corruption, and favoritism are the dominant vices of kings. He will also take your male and female servants, and your strongest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will also tithe your flocks, and you shall be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day because you requested to have a king. This is the reason why monarchy continues. Neither the character of the few good kings there have been since sanctifies the title, nor erases the criminality of the origin. The high praise given to David is not as a king, but as a man pleasing to the Lord. Pausa. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, No, no, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us, and fight our battles. Samuel continued reasoning with them, but fruitlessly. He represented their ingratitude to them, and it was useless. And seeing them fully inclined to their folly, he cried, Is it not the wheat harvest today? I will call to the Lord, and he will send thunder and rain, meaning thunder and rain, which was a punishment because of the damage it would do to their crops. And you shall know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord, in asking for a king for yourselves. And Samuel cried to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And all the people said to Samuel, Pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins this evil, to ask for a king for ourselves. Pausa. These passages of Scripture are direct and positive. They leave no room for equivocal constructions. That the Almighty has stamped his protest against monarchical government in them is certain. Otherwise, the Scripture is false. To the evil of monarchy we have added that of hereditary succession. And just as the former is a degradation in ourselves, so the latter, claimed as a matter of right, is an insult and an imposition upon posterity. Pausa. For all men being equal in their origin, none could by their birth have a right to establish his own family with a perpetual difference above all others. And although someone may have deserved some degree of distinction from his contemporaries in society, nevertheless his descendants may be unworthy to inherit it. Secondly, just as no man could at the beginning possess other public honors than those that were dispensed to him, so the grantors cannot have authority to give the right to posterity. And although they could say, We choose you for our chief, they could not say in the same way, without doing a manifest injustice to their descendants, Your children and your children's children shall reign over ours forever. Pausa. Because a compact so imprudent, so unjust, and so contrary to nature might perhaps in the next succession place them under the government of a rogue or a fool. The majority of the wise, in their private opinions, have always treated hereditary government with contempt. Nevertheless, it is one of those evils difficult to uproot once established. Some submit out of fear, others out of superstition, and the most powerful part divides with the king the spoils he makes from the others. This is supposing that the present race of kings has taken an honorable origin in the world, when on the contrary, it is very probable that if we were to pull back the dark veil of antiquity and follow them to their birth, we would find that the first of them was, at most, the principal murderer of some gang of robbers, and that his coarse manners or preeminence in subtlety earned him the title of chief among the thieves. Pausa. And that, increasing his power and extending his plunder, he intimidated the peaceful and defenseless inhabitants, until he made them purchase their security with frequent contributions. Nevertheless, his electors did not think of giving him hereditary right, because a perpetual exclusion of themselves was compatible with the free and disorderly principle of life they professed. Therefore, hereditary succession in those times of monarchy could not be a matter of claim, but a casual and gratuitous thing. But as then few or no archives existed, and historical tradition was full of fables, it was very easy after the course of a few generations to invent various superstitious tales, properly suited, like those of Muhammad, to make the common people swallow the hereditary right. Perhaps the disorders that threatened, or appeared to threaten, by the death of a leader in the election of a new one, because elections among murderers cannot be very peaceful, induced many at the beginning to favor hereditary claims. And by these means it happened, and has happened since, that what was a mere object of convenience has finally been claimed as a right. England, after the conquest, has known a small number of good monarchs, but has groaned under a greater number of bad ones. No sensible man can say that the usurpation of William the Conqueror was very honorable. A French bastard who lands with an army of bandits and names and establishes himself king against the consent of the natives is in categorical terms a very vile and very despicable origin. There is certainly no intervention of the divinity in this. Finally, it would be useless to spend much time exposing the folly of hereditary right. If there are men so weak as to believe it, let them worship the ass or the lion indiscriminately. So be it for them. As for me, I will neither imitate their humility nor disturb their devotion. Nevertheless, I would content myself with asking them how they suppose the first kings were established. The question only admits one of these three answers, namely, by lot, by election, or by usurpation. If the first king was chosen by lot, this establishes a precedent for the next one, which excludes hereditary succession. Saul was by lot, yet the succession was not hereditary, nor does it seem that there was any intention that it should be. If the first king of some country was by election, this equally establishes a precedent for the next one, because to claim that the first electors, who chose not only a king, but a perpetual family of kings, removed the right of election from all future generations, is an inconceivable absurdity. It is an opinion that finds no support either in sacred or profane history. As for usurpation, no sensible man will dare to defend it, nor will he deny that William the Conqueror was a usurper. This is an undeniable fact. And the pure truth is that the antiquity of the English monarchy hides the injustice of its origin, and does not bear examination. The absurdity of hereditary succession would matter little if its result were not so fatal for humankind. The right of succession would be admissible, and would bear the stamp of divine authority, if it had the virtue of tying up honor, justice, wisdom, and all the necessary qualities for governing in one family. But seeing that more fools than capable men, more madmen than prudent, and more wicked than honest men come from the royal line, we must think that this order of hereditary succession is contrary to nature, and one of the curses of our ignorance. Pausa. Those men who believe they were born only to command, considering their fellows created as beasts of burden to obey, soon become insolent. Full of pride, they only move in a circle of vile flatterers who are interested in hiding from them their true interests and those of the nation. and when they succeed in government, they are generally the most ignorant, the most vicious, and the most incapable men to command. Another evil that hereditary succession brings is that the throne is exposed to being possessed by a minor of any age, during which time the regency, acting in the king's name, has every opportunity and occasion to betray its trust. The same national misfortune occurs when a king, overwhelmed by age and sickness, reaches the last degree of human weakness. In both cases, the people are the victims of the perverse who can successfully intrigue through the follies of old age or infancy. The best reason that has been given in favor of hereditary succession is that it preserves a nation from civil wars, and if this were true, it would carry considerable weight. But on the contrary, it is an insolent falsehood with which it has been intended to deceive humankind. The entire history of England belies this fact. Since the conquest, there have been 30 kings and 2 minors in that disunited kingdom, and in that time at least 8 civil wars and 19 revolutions are counted. Thus, far from promoting peace, said hereditary succession destroys it. England was for many years the bloody theater of war to maintain monarchy and hereditary succession, between the conflicts of the houses of York and Lancaster. 2 notable battles, besides skirmishes and sieges, were fought between Henry and Edward. Twice Henry was a prisoner of Edward, who was also a prisoner of Henry. And the fortune of war and the spirit of a nation is so uncertain when the contest has only personal interests as its object, that Henry was led in triumph from prison to the palace, and Edward obliged to flee to a foreign land. However, as sudden transitions are rarely permanent, Henry, in his turn, was thrown from the throne, and Edward was called for a second time to succeed him. Parliament was always consistent in its selfishness, following the strongest party. The war began in the reign of Henry VI, and did not entirely extinguish until Henry VII, in whom the 2 families were united, covering a period of 63 years, that is, from 1422 to 1485. In conclusion, the succession of hereditary monarchy has covered, not this or that kingdom, but the whole world with blood and ashes. It is a form of government reproved by the word of God, and consequently fatal to all nations. If we were to inquire into the affairs and business of a king, and in many countries they have none, we would see that all of them, after having dissipated their lives without any advantage to the nation, consumed by boredom, tired of the vile flattery of a prostituted court, retire from the scene, yielding their place to a successor who follows the same order of uselessness. In absolute monarchies, the weight of civil and military affairs falls upon the king. The children of Israel in their claims alleged this reason: "And our king shall judge us, and go out before us, and fight our battles." But in countries where there is a constitution, where the ministry dispatches all business, where the king cannot be king or general, as in England, it would be very difficult to know what his indispensable reasons are for the benefit of the people. The closer a government approaches the republican system, the less a king has to do. It is difficult enough to find a proper name for the government of England. William Meredith calls it a republic, but it is unworthy of this name since the corrupted influence of the crown has used the very jobs and favors to pervert the representatives of the House of Commons, the only republican part. The government of England is almost as monarchical as that of France or Spain, but men like to dispute over words without understanding them. The English found their glory on the republican part and on their constitution, and not on the monarchical part. Their liberty depends on their representation in the House of Commons, and if the republican virtue fails there, the nation must necessarily be enslaved. The English constitution is greatly weakened, and must necessarily perish within a short time, because the monarchical part has poisoned the republican, and because the crown has seized all the influence of the House of Commons. In England, a king has no more to do than declare war and provide jobs, which is, in clearer terms, to impoverish the nation and plunge it into confusion. A beautiful occupation indeed, for which he is given $4 million in annual income, and for which divine honors are rendered to him in this world. An honest and industrious man is more useful to society, and more pleasing in the eyes of God, than all the crowned murderers who have lived until now. Chapter 3. Dissertation on the First Principles of Government. There is no subject more interesting for man than that of government. His security, whether rich or poor, and his prosperity are intimately linked to it. Therefore, it is in his interest, and even his duty, to acquire some knowledge of its principles and its application. All sciences and arts, although imperfectly known at first, have been studied, advanced, and brought to what we call perfection by a progressive work of successive generations. But the science of government has lagged behind. Nothing was advanced in the knowledge of its principles, and very little was perfected in its practice until the time of the American Revolution. In all parts of Europe, the same forms and systems established in the remote times of ignorance continue, and their antiquity has the force of principle. Pausa. It is strictly forbidden to investigate their origin, or by what right they exist. If the reason were asked, the answer would be quite easy. Governments are established on false principles, and then they employ all their power to conceal it. Notwithstanding the mystery in which the science of government has been shrouded with the aim of enslaving, robbing, and deceiving humankind, it is the least mysterious of all things, and the easiest to be understood. The shortest capacity will find the thread of this labyrinth if it begins its investigations from a certain point. All sciences and arts have a starting point or alphabet where the study of them begins, and with whose assistance their progress is facilitated. The same method must be observed with respect to the science of government. Instead, then, of initially cluttering the problem with the numerous subdivisions into which the different forms of government are classified, such as aristocracy, oligarchy, monarchy, etc., the best method will be to begin with divisions that can be called primary, or those in which all the various subdivisions of which it is capable are comprised. The primary divisions are only two. 1. Government by election and representation. 2. Government by hereditary succession. All the different forms of government, however numerous and diversified they may be, are classified under one or the other of these primary divisions, because they are either in the system of representation or in the system of hereditary succession. Pausa. As for that equivocal form, which is called mixed government, such as the former one of Holland and the present one of England, it should not make any exception to the general rule, because its parts, considered separately, are either representative or hereditary. Beginning, then, our investigation from this point, we must first examine the nature of these two primary divisions. If they are equally sound in their principles, then the question is one of mere opinion. If one is demonstrably better than the other, this difference directs our choice. But if one of them were so absolutely false that it had no right to exist, the question collapses by itself, because in a contest in which precisely one of the two must be accepted, the proven negative of one becomes an affirmative for the other. The revolutions that are now spreading in the world have their origin in the inquiry into the rights of man. And the present war is a conflict between the representative system, founded on the rights of the people, and the hereditary system, founded on usurpation. The words monarchy, royalty, and aristocracy in themselves mean nothing. The hereditary system, if it continued, would always be the same or worse under any other title. The revolutions of the day have a very pronounced character, for they are all founded on the system of representative government in opposition to the hereditary. No other distinction embraces their principles more completely. Having set out the primary divisions of all government with the utmost generality possible, I proceed first to the examination of the hereditary system, because it has primacy with respect to time. Pausa. The representative system is the invention of the modern world, and there is not the slightest doubt, at least in my opinion, that there is no problem of Euclid more mathematically exact than that of hereditary government having no right to exist. Therefore, when we take away from any man, any king, the exercise of hereditary power, we take away what he has never had the right to possess, and for which no law or custom could or ever can give him any title of possession. The arguments that have been employed until now against the hereditary system have been mainly founded upon its absurdity and incompetence for the supposed end of all government. Nothing can present to our judgment or our imagination a more tangible example of our stupidity than seeing the government of an entire nation fall, as frequently happens, into the hands of a child, necessarily destitute of experience and often little better than a fool. This is an insult to all the men of age, character, and talent in the country. From the moment we begin to reason about hereditary succession, it is impossible to stop laughing, as such a ridiculous automaton as an heir apparent suddenly presents itself to the imagination. But, restraining the laughter provoked by a scarecrow of this kind, let any man ask himself this question: by what right, then, did the hereditary system begin? And he will surely not find an answer that satisfies him. The right that some men or some families had to elevate themselves first to govern a nation, and establish this government as hereditary, was none other than the one Robespierre had to do the same in France. If he had none, neither did they, and if they had some, he had as much, because it is impossible to discover superiority of right in any family, by virtue of which hereditary government should begin. Pausa. The Capets, the Guelphs, the Robespierres, and Marats are all equally in question of right. It belongs to none exclusively. It is a step toward liberty to know that a hereditary government could not begin with an exclusive right in any family. To canonize the hereditary system as a matter of right, alleging the influence of time for it, is an absurd supposition, because it would be substituting time in place of principles or making it superior to them, when, on the contrary, time has no more connection or influence over principles than principles have over time. What was an injustice 1,000 years ago is equally an injustice today, and the right, which is known to be just and legal at the moment it is established, has the same force as if it had been sanctioned 2,000 years ago. Time, with respect to principles, is an eternal now. It influences nothing and never changes their nature and qualities. Besides, what does the duration of 1,000 years have to do with us? The time of our life is but a short portion of this period, and if we find injustice existing at the moment we are born, at that very instant it also begins for us, and our rights begin immediately to resist it, as if it had never existed. Since hereditary government could not be established with a natural right in any family, nor derive any right from time after being established, it only remains for us to examine if any nation has the right to convert it into what is called law, as has happened in England. Pausa. I say no, and that every law or constitution made for this purpose is a betrayal against the rights of the minors of the nation at the time it is made, and against those of subsequent generations. I will speak on each of these cases. Firstly, of the minors and the time when such a law is made, and secondly, of the generations that are to succeed. A nation, taking this word in its full extension, comprises all the individuals who compose it, of whatever age they may be, from their birth to their death. One part of these will be minors and the other adults. The equality of life is not exactly the same in all climates and countries, but in general, the minority in years makes up the greater number. That is to say, the number of persons under 21 years of age is greater than that of those of greater age. This difference in number is not necessary to establish the principle I intend to lay down, but it serves to demonstrate its justice with greater force. The principle would always be equally sound, even if the majority in years were also the majority in number. The rights of minors are as sacred as those of adults. The difference is only in the ages of the two parties, and not in the nature of the rights. These are always the same, and must be preserved immune for the inheritance of the former when they reach adulthood. During the minority of the former, their rights are under the sacred guardianship of the adults. The former cannot renounce them, nor can the latter dispose of them, and consequently, that part of adults that forms the laws of a nation for that moment governs for a few years those who are still minors and who must replace them. And it does not, and cannot, have the right to establish a law erecting a hereditary government, or to speak more clearly, a hereditary succession of governors, because by establishing such a law, they commit the outrage of depriving all the minors of the nation of the inheritance of their rights before they reach adulthood, and subjugate them to a system of government to which during their minority they could neither assent nor contradict. Pausa. Therefore, if the law seeks to guard against the privilege that this part of the nation has to exercise its rights upon reaching the competent age, as it would have executed had it been enabled by its years at the time of establishment, then it must undeniably be considered as a law whose sole object is to remove or annul the rights of all individuals of the nation who are in their minority when it is established. Consequently, there was no right to establish such a law. I now proceed to speak about hereditary government with respect to the coming generations, and to demonstrate that in this case, as in that of minors, there can be no right in a nation to establish it. A nation, although existing in all times, is always in a state of renewal by a continuous succession. Its course cannot be stopped. Each day produces new individuals, brings minors closer to maturity, and drags the old to the grave. In this uninterrupted course of generations, there is no one part superior in authority to the other. If we could conceive of superiority in any, at what instant of time or in what century of the world would we fix its birth? To what cause would we attribute it? By what evidence would we prove it? By what criterion would we know it? A single reflection will teach us that our ancestors were not during their life, but like us, tenants in the great feudal estate of rights. The absolute lordship of these, neither did they have it, nor do we have it. It belongs to the entire family of men in all ages. Pausa. To think otherwise is to think either as slaves or as tyrants. As slaves, because we believe that some of the past generations had authority to oblige us, and as tyrants, because we believe we have the authority to oblige those who are to succeed us. It does not seem out of place to try to define what should be understood by a generation, and in what sense this word is used here. Since it is a natural term, its meaning is quite clear. The father, the son, and the grandson are distinct generations. Pausa. But when we speak of a generation, describing the persons in whom legal authority resides, as distinct from another with respect to the persons who are to succeed, all those who are over 21 years of age at that time must be included in it, and a generation of this kind will continue in authority for between 14 and 21 years, that is, until the number of minors who have reached that age is greater than the remaining portion of the preceding strain. For example, if France, at this or some other moment, contains 24 million souls, 12 million will be men, and the others women. Of the first 12 million, 6 will be of the age of 21 years, and the others less. And the authority to govern will reside in the former. But every day there will be some alteration, and in the space of 21 years each of these surviving minors will have reached the competent age, and the greater part of the former strain will have disappeared. Pausa. The majority of those who then live, and in whom authority resides, will be composed of those who 20 years earlier had no legal existence. These will be fathers and grandfathers in their turn, and in the following 21 years or less another race of minors, upon reaching the majority, will replace them, and so on. As this is always the case, and since every generation is equal in rights to another, it is a clear consequence that there can be no right in any to establish a government by hereditary succession, because it would be supposing itself mistress of a right superior to the rest. This is the right to determine by its own authority how the world is to be governed henceforth, and who is to govern it. Pausa. Every age and every generation is, and must be by right, as free to act for itself in all cases as the age and the generation that has preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing even from beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. Man has no property over another man, nor does one generation have it over those that are to come. In the first part of the Rights of Man, I have spoken of government by hereditary succession, and I will conclude here with an extract from that work in the 2 following chapters. 1. What right has a family to establish itself by its own authority with hereditary power? 2. What right has a nation to establish a particular family with such privileges? With respect to the first of these chapters, that of a family establishing itself by its own authority with hereditary power independent of the nation, every man would agree to call it despotism, and anyone who attempted to sustain it would offend his own understanding. With respect to the second chapter, that of a nation establishing a particular family with hereditary power, it does not appear as despotism at first sight. But if men give way to second reflections and carry them forward, considering, if not their own persons, those of their posterity, they will then see that hereditary succession becomes for others the same despotism that the persons who preceded them reprobated for themselves. This is to exclude the consent of the generation that follows, and the exclusion of this consent is despotism. Let us consider the generation that undertakes to establish a family with hereditary power, separately from the generations that are to follow. The generation that first elects a person and places him at the head of its government, whether with the title of king or with some other nominal distinction, makes its own choice, whether wise or foolish, as a free agent of itself. Pausa. The person thus elevated is not hereditary, but proposed and elected, and the generation that establishes him does not then live under a hereditary government, because of this, but under a government that it has chosen itself. Even if the person elevated in this way, and the generation that elevates him, were to live forever, it would never be hereditary succession, and this would only follow upon the death of one of the two parties. Hereditary succession being, then, a matter out of the question with respect to the first generation that establishes it. Let us consider the character of this same generation and its operations with respect to the generation that begins, and the others that are to succeed it. It takes on a character for which it has had neither title nor right, because from a legislator it also passes to a testator, and in bequeathing the government, it attempts to make a will that must be executed after its death, and it not only attempts to bequeath, but also to establish upon the coming generation a new and different form under which it itself has not lived. It lived, as has already been observed, not under a hereditary government, but under a government made by its own choice. And now it attempts, with no other virtue than its will, and a testament that it had no authority to make, to take from the generation that begins, and the others that are to succeed it, the right and free agency by virtue of which it acted for itself. In whatever way hereditary succession is considered, as arising only from the will and testament of a preceding nation, it presents itself to the human understanding only as a crime and an absurdity. The letter A cannot force the letter B to take its property from it and give it to C. However, this is the way in which what is called hereditary succession by law is acted upon. A certain generation, by an act of its will, pretends, under the form of a law, to take away the rights of the generation that begins, and of all others to come, and transfers them to a third person, who assumes the government in consequence of this illicit transfer. The history of the English Parliament presents us with an example of this kind, and one that deserves to be remembered as the greatest proof of legislative ignorance and the greatest lack of principles that can be found in the history of any country. The case is as follows. The English Parliament in the year 1688 brought a man with his wife from Holland, William and Mary, and made them King and Queen of England. Having done this, the said Parliament made a law to transfer the government of the country to the heirs of said sovereigns, conceived in the following terms. We the Lords temporal, spiritual, and commons, in the name of the people of England, most humbly and faithfully submit ourselves, our heirs and posterities, to William and Mary, their heirs and posterities forever. And, in a subsequent law, cited by Edmund Burke, the same Parliament, in the name of the people of England who were then living, binds the said people, their heirs and posterities, to William and Mary, their heirs and posterities until the end of time. It is not enough to laugh at the ignorance of such legislators. It is also necessary to prove their lack of principles. The Constituent Assembly of France in 1791 incurred the same error as the Parliament of England when it established a hereditary succession in the family of the Capets by an act of the Constitution of that year, pausa, that each nation, for the time it lives, has the right to govern itself as it pleases, must always be admitted. But government by hereditary succession is a government for another race, and not for it alone. And just as those over whom it is to be exercised did not yet exist, or were minors, so too did the right to establish it for them not exist. To assume such a right would be a betrayal against the right of posterity. I end the arguments here with respect to the first chapter on government by hereditary succession, and proceed to examine the second, on government by election and representation, or, as it can be said more concisely, representative government as opposed to hereditary government. Having proven that hereditary government has no right to exist, and that it must be excluded from all society, it follows that representative government is the best, and the one that must be admitted. When contemplating government by election and representation, we will not stop to inquire how, when, or by what right it exists. Its origin is always in sight. Man himself is the origin and the evidence of his right. It belongs to him by his existence, and his person proves it. The only true basis of representative government is the equality of rights. Every man has the right to one vote and no more in the election of representatives. The rich man has no more right to exclude the poor man from the right to vote or to elect and be elected than the poor man has to exclude the rich man. And whenever one of the two parties attempts or proposes it, it will be a question of force and not of right. Who is the one who would want to exclude another? That other has the right to exclude him. What is now called aristocracy implies an inequality of rights. But who are the persons who have the right to establish this inequality? Will the rich exclude themselves? No, Will the poor exclude themselves? No. By what right, then, can anyone be excluded? It would be a new question whether any man or any class of men has the right to exclude himself. But be that as it may, the certainty is that they cannot have the right to exclude another. The poor will never delegate a right like this to the rich, nor the rich to the poor. And to assume it is not only to assume an arbitrary power, but to arrogate a right to commit robbery. Personal rights, among which the principal is that of voting for one's representatives, are a kind of property of the most sacred character, and he who employs his pecuniary property and avails himself of his influence to attempt to take or rob another of his property of right would be using his money as he would use firearms, and would well deserve to have it taken away from him. Inequality owes its origin to the combination of one part of the community that excludes the other from its rights. Whenever an article of the Constitution or law is made in which the right to vote or to elect and be elected belongs exclusively to a number of persons who possess a certain amount of property, be it great or small, it is a combination of those individuals who possess this amount to exclude those who do not possess it. It is vesting themselves with authority, and considering themselves as the superior part of society, to the exclusion of the rest. It must always be considered as granted or conceded that those who oppose the equality of rights never want the exclusion to apply to them. And in this respect, aristocracy presents itself as an object of ridicule. Pausa. This flattering vanity is supported by another idea no less self-interested, which is that the opponents conceive they are playing a safe game where they can have the luck of winning without the least risk of losing, that one way or another the principle of equality includes them, and that if they cannot obtain more rights than the persons they oppose and want to exclude, they will not have lost anything. Pausa. This opinion has already been fatal to many thousands who, not content with equal rights, have sought more, until they have lost everything, and have experienced upon themselves the degrading inequality they sought to establish over others. However one considers it, it is dangerous and impolitic, often ridiculous and always unjust, to found the right to vote upon wealth. If the sum or amount of property of the subjects in whom the right should fall is considerable, it will exclude the majority of the people, and unite them in a common interest against the government and against those who support it. And since power is always in the majority, it can very well destroy such a government and its supporters at any moment it wishes. If, to avoid this danger, a small amount of property is fixed as the rule for the right, this itself makes liberty contemptible, by placing it in competition with accidental and insignificant things. Pausa. If a mare by chance were to give birth to a colt or a mule that was worth the stipulated sum, it would give its owner the right to vote, but upon its death the right would be taken away. In whom would the origin of such a right exist? Would it be in the man or in the mule? When we consider how many means there are to acquire property without merit, and to lose it through misfortune, we reject the idea of choosing wealth as the basis of rights. But the most offensive part in this case is that this exclusion from the right to vote indicates a mark of infamy on the moral character of the excluded persons. And this is precisely what no part of the community has the right to pronounce against the other. No external circumstance can justify it. Wealth is not proof of moral character, nor is poverty proof of the lack of it. On the contrary, wealth is most often the presumptive evidence of wickedness, and poverty the negative evidence of innocence. Therefore, if property, be it little or much, is considered as a rule for preference, the means that have been practiced to acquire, it must also be taken into consideration. The only reason upon which the exclusion from the right to vote can justly be founded would be to impose it, instead of corporal punishment for a certain time, upon those who propose to take this right away from others. Pasa. The right to vote for one's representatives is the primary right, by which all other rights are protected. To take this away from a man is to reduce him to the state of slavery, in that this consists only in being subject to the will of another, and he who has no vote in the election of his representatives is in this case pausa. The proposition, therefore, of disenfranchising any class of men is as criminal as that of taking away their property. When we speak of right, it is necessary to unite the idea of duty to this word. Right becomes a duty through reciprocity. The right a man enjoys imposes on him the obligation to guarantee it to another. He who violates this obligation justly incurs the penalty of forfeiture of right. The strength and permanent security of a government is proportional to the number of people interested in sustaining it. The true and best policy, then, must be to interest the whole through the equality of rights, because danger originates from exclusions. It is possible to exclude men from the right to vote, but it is impossible to exclude them from the right to rebel against this exclusion. And when they are violently deprived of all other rights, the right of rebellion becomes perfect and just. As long as men could be persuaded that they had no rights, or that these belonged to a certain class, or that the government was a thing that existed by a right in itself, it was not difficult to govern them by authority. The ignorance in which they were kept, and the superstition in which they were instructed, provided the means to do so. But when ignorance has disappeared, and superstition with it, when they perceive the deception they have been under, when they reflect that the cultivator and the manufacturer are the primordial means of all the wealth that exists in the world, even beyond what nature spontaneously produces, when they begin to feel their consequences through their utility, and their rights as members of society. Pasa. It is not possible then to govern them any longer as before. Fraud once discovered can no longer be repeated. To attempt it is to provoke laughter or to promote total destruction. That property will always be unequal is certain. Industry, superiority of talents, skill in management, extreme frugality, fortunate opportunities, or the contrary of all these causes, the weariness of them, will always produce this effect, without having to resort to the harsh and discordant names of avarice and oppression. And besides this, there are men who, although they do not despise riches, will not humble themselves to the baseness of the means of acquiring them, nor will they bother with the care of them more than their needs or independence require, while in others there is a great desire to obtain them by all means that are not reprehensible. This is the sole business of their life, and they pursue it as they might pursue their religion. All that is required with respect to goods of fortune is to obtain them honestly and not to use them criminally. But they will be used criminally whenever they serve as a rule for rights of exclusion. In institutions that are purely pecuniary, such as those of a bank or a commercial company, the rights of the members who compose the company are entirely created by the property they have put into it, and no other of the rest is represented in the government of the company except those that originate from the property. Nor does this government have knowledge of anything else but its property. But the case is entirely different with respect to the institution or civil government organized under the system of representation. Such a government has knowledge of all things and of all men, as members of the national society, whether they have property or not, and therefore the principle requires that all men and all kinds of rights be represented. And one of them is, although not the most important, the right to acquire and enjoy property. The protection of a man's person is more sacred than the protection of goods of fortune. And besides this, the faculty of doing any work or service by means of which he acquires food or maintains his family enters into the nature of property. This faculty is a property for him. He has acquired it, and it is the object of his protection as much as his property acquired by any means can be for others. I have always believed that the best security for property, whether little or much, is to remove from all parts of the community, as much as possible, all cause for complaint, and all motive for violence, and this can only be achieved by an equality of rights. When rights are secure, property is consequently secure. But when property serves as a pretext for unequal or exclusive rights, then it weakens the right to enjoy property, and provokes indignation and tumult. Because it is not natural to believe that property can be secure under the guarantee of a society whose rights are injured by the influence of said property. To the injustice and bad policy of using property as a pretext for exclusive rights, the inexplicable absurdity of giving a mere sound, the idea of property and attaching certain rights to it follows. For what else is a title but a sound? Nature is frequently giving the world some extraordinary men who achieve fame through merit and universal consent, such as Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, etc. These were truly great or noble. Pausa. But when the government establishes a manufacture of nobles, it is as absurd as if it undertook a manufacture of wise men. Its nobles are all counterfeit. Just as honestly acquired property is best secured by the equality of rights, so too dishonestly acquired property makes its protection consist in a monopoly of them. He who has stolen another's property will immediately strive to deprive him of his rights to secure himself in it, because when the thief becomes a legislator, he believes himself secure. The part of the government of England that is called the House of Lords was composed in its origin of persons who committed the robberies I am speaking of. It was an association for the protection of the property they had usurped. Aristocracy, in addition to the criminality of its origin, produces an injurious effect on the moral and physical character of man. It weakens human faculties like slavery, because just as the spirit, cast down by the latter, loses the elasticity of its powers in silence, so too, by the opposite extreme, when it is exalted by folly, it becomes incapable of using them and falls into imbecility. It is impossible that a spirit that entertains and occupies itself with ribbons and titles can ever be great. The trivialities of objects consume the man. It is necessary at all times, and more particularly while the progress of a revolution lasts and until habit confirms right ideas, that we frequently revive our patriotism with the memory of the first principles. To properly understand the spirit of institutions, it is necessary to always keep their origin in view. An investigation of our origin will show us that rights are not gifts from one man to another, nor from one class of men to another, because who is he who would be the first donor, or by what principle, or with what authority could he possess the faculty of giving them? A declaration of rights is neither a creation nor a donation of them, but a manifestation of the principle by which they exist, accompanied by a detail of what they are in themselves, because every civil right has a natural one as its foundation, which includes the principle of a reciprocal guarantee of these rights from one man to another. Pausa. Thus, since it is impossible to discover any origin of right that is not derived from man himself, it consequently follows that rights belong to man by the right of his sole existence, and must therefore be equal to all. Pausa. The principle of an equality of rights is clear and simple. All men can understand it, and by understanding their rights, they know their duties. For where the rights of men are equal, each one must finally see the necessity of protecting the rights of others, as it is the most effective means of securing his own. But if in forming a constitution we deviate from the principle of the equality of rights, or attempt any modification in them, we enter a labyrinth of difficulties from which we will find no way out. Where shall we fix ourselves? Or by what principle shall we find the point where we must stop to distinguish between men of the same country, which part of them should be free and which should not? If property serves as a rule, it will be to deviate entirely from every moral principle of liberty, because rights are attributed to mere matter, and man is made the agent of it. It is, moreover, to present property as an apple of discord, and not only to excite but to justify a war against it. Because I uphold the principle that when property is used as an instrument to take away the rights of those who by chance do not possess it, it is used for an illegal end, as firearms would be in a similar case. Nature in its primitive state made all men equal in rights, but not in power. The weak cannot protect himself against the strong. This being the case, the institution of civil society has as its object to form an equation of powers that are parallel and guarantees of the equality of rights. The laws of a country, when properly made, contribute to this end. All men for their protection avail themselves of the arm of the law, as stronger than their own. And therefore every man has an equal right in the formation of the government, and of the laws that are to govern and judge him. In countries and societies that are too extensive, as in America and France, each individual can only exercise this power by delegation, that is, by election and representation. And from this arises the institution of representative government. So far, I have limited myself to matters of principle only. First, that hereditary government has no right to exist, that it cannot be established by any principle of right, and that on the contrary, it is a violation of all principles. Second, that government by election and representation has its origin in the natural and eternal rights of man. Because whether man were his own legislator, as he would be in that primitive state of nature, or whether he exercised his portion of legislative sovereignty in his own person, as could happen in small democracies where all can meet for the formation of the laws by which they are to be governed, or whether he exercised it in the election of the persons who are to represent him in the National Assembly of Representatives. The origin of the right is the same in all cases. The first, as stated before, is defective in power. The second is practicable only in democracies of small extent. The third is the largest scale on which a human government can be established. Matters of principle are followed by matters of opinion, and thus it is necessary to make a distinction between the two. Whether the rights of man are to be equal is not a matter of opinion, but of right, and consequently of principle. Because men do not possess their rights as grants from one to another, but each one has his own inherent right. Society is the curator of these rights, but not the donor. And since in extended societies, such as in America and France, the right of individuals in matters of government cannot be exercised except by election and representation, it consequently follows that where simple democracy is impracticable, the only system founded on principles is the representative one. Posse. But as for the organic part, or the manner in which the different parts of the government are to be ordered and composed, it is purely a matter of opinion. It is necessary that all parts agree with the principle of equality of rights, and the more religiously they adhere to this principle, the less material errors can be introduced. Nor will they continue for long in that part which touches upon matters of opinion. In all matters of opinion, the social pact, or the principle by which society must be governed, requires that the majority of opinions be a rule for all, and that the minority render a practical obedience to it. This is perfectly in accordance with the principle of equality of rights, because in the first place, it is assumed that one does not know beforehand which side a man's opinion will be on in any question, whether in favor or against. It may well happen that in some questions he finds himself in the number of the majority, and in others in that of the minority. And by the same rule that he expects obedience in one case, he must also render it in the other. Pausa. All the disorders that have arisen in France during the progress of the Revolution have had their origin, not in the principle of the equality of rights, but in the violation of this principle. The principle of the equality of rights has been repeatedly violated, and not by the majority, but by the minority. And this minority has been composed of men who possessed property, as well as those who did not possess it, which proves well that property, in addition to what experience teaches, is no more proof of character than it is of rights. It will often happen that the minority is right and the majority is not. But as soon as experience proves this to be the case, the minority will become the majority, and the error will reform itself by the tranquil operation of freedom of opinions and equality of rights. Nothing can then justify an insurrection, nor can it ever be necessary, when rights are equal and opinions are free. Taking, then, the principle of equality of rights as the foundation of the Revolution, and consequently of the Constitution, the organic part, or the manner in which the different parts of the government are to be ordered in the Constitution, will pertain, as has already been said, to the matter of opinion. Various methods will be presented in a question of this kind, and although experience is still lacking to determine which is the best, I still think it has sufficiently decided which is the worst. That is the worst which in its deliberations and decisions is subject to the haste and passion of an individual. And when the entire legislature is concentrated in a single body, it is an individual in a mass. Pausa. In all cases of deliberation, it is necessary to have a reserve body, and it is much better to divide the representation by lot into two parts, and let them revise and correct one another, than for the whole to gather and debate at the same time. Representative government is not necessarily limited to any particular form. The principle is the same in all the forms under which it can be coordinated. The equality of the people's rights is the root from which all branches emanate, and its different branches can be organized according to present opinion, or as future experience best teaches. As for the Hospital for Incurables, as Chesterfield calls the House of Lords in England, it is nothing but the excrescence of corruption, and there is no more affinity or resemblance between any of the branches of a legislative body, originated from the right of the people, and the said House of Lords, than between a regular member of the human body and a gangrenous wen. As for the part of the government called executive, it is necessary in the first place to establish a precise meaning of the word. There are only two divisions in which power can be ordered. First, to deliberate will or decree laws. Second, to execute them or put them into practice. The first corresponds to the intellectual faculties of the human mind, which reasons and determines what should be done. The second to the mechanical power of the human body, which puts this determination into practice. If the first decides and the latter does not execute, it is a state of imbecility. And if the latter executes without the determination of the former preceding it, it is a state of frenzy. Pausa. The executive department is therefore official and is subject to the legislative, as the body is to the mind in a state of health, because it is impossible to conceive the idea of two sovereignties, one with respect to willing and the other with respect to executing. The executive is not vested with the power to deliberate whether or not to act. It has no discretionary authority in the case, because it cannot do otherwise than what the law decrees, and is obliged to act according to it. And in this consideration, the executive is composed of all the official departments that execute the laws, among which the one called the judicial power has primacy. But humankind has conceived the idea that another kind of authority is necessary to watch over the execution of the laws and ensure that they are faithfully executed. And confusing this superintending authority with the official re-execution, we find ourselves confused about the term executive, power, pausa. All the parts in the government of the United States of America that are called executive are nothing but the authorities to watch over the execution of the laws, and are so independent of the legislative that they only know it through the laws, and cannot be governed or directed by it by any other means. The way in which this superintending authority should be ordered and organized is a matter of mere opinion. Some may prefer one method and others another, and in all cases where only opinion and not principles is concerned, the majority of opinions forms the rule for all. Pausa. There are, however, some things that can be deduced by reason and proven by experience, which serve to guide our decision in the case. One is never to vest any individual with extraordinary power, because in addition to putting him in the temptation of misusing it, it would incite contention and commotion in the people by aspiring to the position. And the other is not to place a vast or lasting power in the hands of any number of individuals. The inconveniences that can be supposed for frequently relieving them are less to be feared than the danger that arises from a long continuation. In office, I will conclude this discourse by offering some observations on the means of preserving liberty, because it is not only necessary that we establish it, but also that we preserve it. It is necessary in the first place that we make a distinction between the means that have been used to destroy despotism in order to prepare the way for the establishment of liberty, and those that are to be used after it has been destroyed. The means used in the first case are justified by necessity. These are generally insurrections, because while the established government of despotism continues in a country, it is almost impossible for any other means to be used. It is also certain that at the beginning of a revolution, the revolutionary party allows itself the exercise of power at its discretion, governed more by circumstances than by principles, because liberty would never be established otherwise, and if it were established, it would soon be overturned. Pausa. It is never to be expected that all men in a revolution should change their opinion at the same instant. There was never a truth or principle so irresistibly evident that it was believed by all men at the same time. Reason and time must cooperate with one another for the final establishment of any principle, and therefore those who are convinced first have no right to persecute the others in whom conviction works more slowly. The moral principle of revolutions is to instruct and not to destroy. If a constitution had been established 2 years earlier, as should have been done, the violence that has since devastated France and injured the character of the revolution would have been prevented, in my opinion. The nation would then have had a rallying point, and every individual would have known the path he should follow in his conduct. But instead of doing this, a revolutionary government was substituted in its place, a form without any principle or authority. Virtue and vice depended indiscriminately on events, and what was patriotism one day became treason the next. Pausa. All this was a consequence of the lack of a constitution, because the nature and intention of a constitution is to prevent being governed by parties, by establishing a common principle that will limit and govern the power and impulse of the party, and which will say to all parties, "Thus far shall you go, and no farther." But for lack of a constitution, man looks entirely to the party, and instead of principles governing the party governs the principles. The desire to punish is always dangerous to liberty, and causes men to extend themselves to misinterpret and misapply even the best of laws. He who wants to see his own liberty secure must protect even his enemy from oppression, because he who violates this duty establishes an example that will reach him himself another day. Thank you for listening to this audiobook until the end. If you enjoyed the content, we invite you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss our next publications.